Hi, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bin Ngo, and I'll be your moderator. On behalf of the Canadian Institute for Safety, Wellness, and Performance, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Before we jump in, I'd like to announce that this meeting will be recorded and transcribed. This ensures that those unable to attend can still benefit from the valuable discussions and insights that will be shared today. Additionally, in case you needed the closed captioning feature, I'd like to point out that you can click the three dots at the top of your team screen. It should say more underneath it, and you should see an option to turn on either live captions or transcription or transcribe. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. Both CISWP and WOHSS acknowledge that the lands on which we are hosting this meeting include the traditional territories of many nations. We recognize that the many injustices experienced by many of the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada continue to affect their health and well-being. We respect that Indigenous people have rich cultural and traditional practices that have been known to improve health outcomes. So I invited all attendees to reflect on the territories you are calling in from as we commit ourselves to gaining knowledge, forging a new culturally safe relationship, and contributing to reconciliation. Now, allow me to introduce the Institute and our speakers. We have Heather Burns and Denise Howitt. So CISWP is committed to making Canadian workplaces productive and sustainable by collaborating across disciplines. Our aim is to position Canada as a global leader in empowering businesses to thrive in a competitive economy. We focus on improving workforce safety, wellness, and performance through our research, through our knowledge transfer, and through workforce development. By working closely with our stakeholders, we conduct innovative research, we create evidence-based tools and services, and we address knowledge gaps in the field. Our host for today is Heather Burns. Heather, hi, how's it going? Heather is a strategic and innovative human resource professional who builds and leads strategic talent management initiatives to create a better working world. Heather believes in linking people initiatives to organizational priorities to elevate performance and drive engagement. She has a passion for leadership development, performance, and employee experience, diversity, and inclusion. Heather has experience across a variety of industries, all the way from financial services to the public sector and to even now post-secondary, right? She has a master's degree in business administration and a graduate certificate in adult education, and she is a chartered professional in human resources. Welcome, Heather. And Denise Howe. Awesome. Denise Howitt is a distinguished Canadian registered safety professional and a Canadian risk manager with over 25 years of experience in occupational health and safety management. Her expertise spans legislative compliance, risk assessment, and injury prevention. She's recognized as one of the top women in safety in 2021 and 2023 by the Canadian Occupational Safety magazine. That's really cool. Denise's career is marked by her dedication to enhancing safety cultures and promoting effective health and safety practices across various industries. Currently, Denise leads a specialized team within the University of Calgary's Environmental Health and Safety Department. There, she leverages her extensive background to influence university processes and practices, ensuring systematic engagement of EHS performance and compliance. Very important. Since joining the university in 2017, Denise has been instrumental in integrating robust safety protocols that safeguard the health and welfare of campus communities. Welcome, Denise. While we've received some questions beforehand, we strongly encourage you to continue asking questions during the webinar in the anonymous Q&A section. Rest assured, these questions will be addressed either during the session or afterward, depending on time constraints. We should be fine. We've made provisions for you to actively participate through this Q&A feature. We were trying to get polls to work earlier. Something went wrong. So any single time we'll have a poll question, I'll be creating it in the Q&A section, and you will be able to insert your answer there or come up with an answer freeword as well. Yes. Should people wish to continue the conversation after this webinar, I will be sharing ways to connect with Heather and Denise in the post-webinar email where you will be able to reach out and connect. So please now join me in welcoming to the stage Heather Burns. Heather, it's all you.
Thank you, and I am so excited to be here and welcome everyone. Denise and I have worked together for a number of years, and we are delighted to be here with you this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you're joining from. Denise and I are both based out of Calgary, Alberta, and so we appreciate the sense of community and the land acknowledgement earlier, so thank you for that. So that was a lovely introduction. I feel like I should be accomplishing more in my workday based on that description. But for the purposes of today, we're going to talk about effective conflict management in the workplace. And I was delighted to have this opportunity to connect with all of you on this. We have a lot of things we can talk about in a pretty condensed format today, but we're going to focus on some key concepts and hopefully for you actionable strategies within our kind of next 25 minutes together, and then really get into some Q&A at the end as time permits. So as been suggested, let us know your questions, or if anything comes up during the conversation we have and you want to make note of it, we'd love to hear from you, and hopefully we have time to get to all of those today. And what we don't, we can definitely continue our conversation after this. Anything you wanted to add, Denise?
No, I think you covered it all. You're making my job easy.
Excellent. I'm happy to. So a little bit of the kind of logistics was already touched on.
Sorry, share your screen. Share your screen for me.
Right. You can't see?
Yeah, no worries.
Hold on. It was there and then I made it disappear. Apologies.
It's okay. It was during my intro. I appreciate that.
How about now?
Perfect.
Can you see some?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I got you. You were there.
Great. So we talked about the timing. We've talked about questions. For the purposes of this, we use the Q&A rather than the chat function. This makes virtual webinars like this more efficient. And the polls, as mentioned, will happen via the Q&A feature as well. So we encourage you to share with us because that can help guide our conversation wherever we can this morning and this afternoon. All right, we're going to talk about, and a lot of this was in the material when you registered, what does conflict really mean? Sometimes even our definitions are different, and that can be where it's originally easy to come up with some conflicting views on things. So what is conflict? What are the types of conflict, and what causes conflict in our workplaces? The importance of creating positive work environments, because that tends to be a longer term strategy to reducing conflict. And sometimes we need to manage conflict in the short term as it happens, and we'll talk about that. And then focus a bit on solutions-based discussion techniques. This is something when I've studied and done similar workshops on conflict, we've had some really good dialogue around. It's that whole perspective to how we approach conflict and even our communication as work groups as a whole. And then lastly, we'll wrap up a little bit around our approach to building team cohesion. And this isn't just for folks who lead teams, this is for all of us and the many teams we interact with, either directly or indirectly in our work. But I think for the purposes of kind of getting our head in the right space for our conversation, our first question, I'm curious, when you see conflict, what do you want to do? What does conflict make you want to do? What's your response? So just in the Q&A, if you could pop that in, and then we'll just have a quick conversation about that before we look into a more formal definition.
So basically right now, folks should be able to join or click the Q&A section up top. You'll be able to see it looks like a little question mark in a bubble. I've typed in when I see conflict, I want to ... Perfect. Someone left a comment. That's exactly what we were hoping for. Avoid. Thank you so much. Another person said, figure out why it's happening and what the motivating factors for it are. We have deal with it. I like that. Fix it. Okay. Accommodate. Very nice. Can we just keep this going for give people another like few 30 seconds, another minute or so? Yeah.
Absolutely. And maybe I'll
Did you
touch
have
on a couple of those.
options?
Well, yeah.
Turtle,
And I
turtles.
love how folks are not just saying they want to run away or avoid, and not that there's anything wrong or the least bit not human about our desire to avoid conflict. We like harmony. We like things as they should. So I'm impressed with how many folks are
I will
saying
say
they
one
just
person
want to
did say
deal.
avoid. Like the first person was like, "Oh, I would like to avoid it." Two more. Analyze. Another person said, "Reaction depends on my relationship with the other folks involved." Very true.
Yeah, definitely. And avoid is a actually when we look at different conflict styles, sometimes that is the best answer. It just gets challenging when we try to apply that to every conflict scenario.
Yeah.
There's an assessment that I'll share a little bit more about out of actually UFC that looks at our conflict styles. And someone on my team once was like, I don't know, I avoid, I'll never be successful in navigating conflict. And it's like, no, sometimes you know when conflict doesn't need to be addressed, but you may have to
Well,
step into a different style to address it.
sometimes the relationship is more important than the dealing with the conflict.
Absolutely. And it can also be, Denise, I think we've had this conversation, at least for me as the parent of teenagers, sometimes the desire to be right rather than do right is sometimes avoiding the conflict is the right and the kind and the appropriate response. So thank you all for your comments on that. And I know it can be a little tricky to move over to a Q&A, so we appreciate you giving us that feedback.
100%. So just two last comments so far before I ask you to move on. Take time to understand the cause of it, get more information and address it. So we got some analytic people too. It's very cool.
Excellent, excellent. Absolutely. And we're going to go through a really good model that has not completely new, but I love how they packaged it out of the University of Victoria that Denise had shared with me, and she'll touch on kind of how she learned more about it. That really does, that's where it starts, because sometimes we're a little too, we jump to action when it comes to conflict without that better understanding of what's going on. I found it interesting when I first started looking at conflict, and pretty much in every course I teach, we talk about the definition of it, and when we have more time, even in groups, because even the three of us as moderators and presenters on this call may have different definitions of conflict. But it's interesting to me that even the definition of conflict is somewhat complicated, and that sometimes it's a noun, sometimes it's a verb. Sometimes I may think we're in conflict, and Denise may be like, no, we're just having a really, really engaging conversation. I don't feel any conflict. I'm excited. And I'm like, I just want to get out of this conversation. And so that is part of where conflict can get tricky for all of us. But I think for our time together today and where I've found the most value when I think about conflict is as we go through the next 15 to 20 minutes in terms of the content, reflect on someone that maybe you're currently in conflict with or someone you've experienced conflict with in the past that we maybe wish would have gone differently, or it was more challenging than you thought. And keep that person in mind as we talk about the different approaches and if maybe things could have been done differently as we talked a little bit about some opportunities on this topic. We are talking about conflict for a reason. It's interesting when I met with some folks from WAS about this series, there's a few different things that I teach that we talked about, but conflict is definitely on the rise. And this is, I liked this because it was Canadian statistics, not that our neighbors to the south are that different. But in the last, this is generally based on 2022 through 2024 data, 25% of Canadian employees are experiencing increased tension or conflict at work. And those of us that experience conflict are losing an average of 55 days per work year due to factors associated with that conflict.
Yeah. So, Heather, are you seeing any trends in terms of the common causes of why the conflict is on the rise in the workplace?
There's definitely, like, based on the research and even my experience working with some teams and in workshops like this, a big driver, at least in our Alberta marketplace, was kind of that reimagining of remote and hybrid work. and the tension it created between leaders and employees in terms of coming back into work and what that expectation looked like and why folks were. That's been an interesting one that isn't consistent, prior to folks who maybe hadn't had that opportunity to work remotely before. It's also, a lot of it's based on workload. Folks are feeling burnt out and unsupported, and even feedback from their leaders is similar. Leaders are trying to protect their people, but just being asked to do more with less. And so that's a big driver of it. But it tends to vary from organization to organization, but those are definitely some really common themes at the moment.
Thank
I
you.
don't know if you had any other thoughts
No,
on
I
what
think
we're noticing.
those are really the same things that I've been noticing as well. So I was interested to
Yeah.
hear your perspective. Thank you.
Definitely, definitely. I think part of it as well that comes with both of those are the economic impacts folks feel too. We always know people get more stressed out when it comes to things like money, and we all know the cost of living is costing more. So sometimes folks are having external pressures, but when we look at stress and the source of conflict in the workplace, it tends to be those two things for sure. Again, I kind of joked about my teenagers, feeding teenagers these days is a bit of an adventure, cost a lot to feed our families. And so folks have more money pressures, but sometimes we bring that personal stress to work with us. So our next kind of question, where I'd love to hear from all of you, because Denise and I touched on this in the last slide, but when we think about where conflict is coming from in the workplace, and like we know maybe why it's rising, but even prior to the pandemic and remote work, what have you seen as the causes of conflict in your workplace? Is it things like communication issues, personality differences, sometimes lead to bias, change? We're seeing so much change in our workplaces for many of us. Sometimes it's leadership, and sometimes that's a change in leadership, or it's just leadership that we struggle with. And perhaps it's all of the above and more. So if you don't mind sharing with us in that Q&A a little bit about what you see as the causes of workplace conflict.
Just added the question in the Q&A section. Feel free to click the same comment. Thank you so much. Incivility, yeah. Incompetence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be
yeah.
related to almost all those points too, right? That's interesting. I'll let you share them. I'm always so excited to like touch on every.
No, it's great. Communication issues, differences in values between staff and leadership, or changes happening way too fast. There's another person said lack of being visible. 100%.
Absolutely. We definitely are experiencing that, and just our definition, maybe this is a different course, but around communication norms and how we interact with our colleagues and leaders and folks on our teams. That has definitely evolved over the last 2 to 5 years for sure. That communication issues, and we talked a little bit about in the overview of this course about, I find when I'm asked to help a team that's really struggling with conflict, you can pretty much count on there being a rumor mill, a gossip line. Sometimes even the leader is like, oh, I need to tell you about this thing. And it's like, we're already being secretive and not transparent about what's going on. Clear communication, whether it's expectations, what our goals are, what our training needs to be, what people, like when we talk about things like incompetence or lack of value alignment, communication really, really drives that. And we sometimes worry in the age of information about over communicating, but it's always better to be as transparent as we can, as clear as we can, because that tends to be where gossip and rumors and that kind of toxic work environment starts to percolate up into our teams, and what really drives conflict and feeds it, so to speak. Personality differences, again, We all respond to change differently. Sometimes we like to be communicated to differently. Sometimes what we think is funny or exciting can be different, and we don't always check our biases when it comes to how we respond to things. And I totally understand this change fatigue. I don't know if that's ever going to go away. So how do we navigate that? How do we kind of bring it into to something that's seen as more positive than negative? And that's definitely a leadership challenge for sure. And leaders don't always appreciate the impact of their decisions on everyone. So there's a bit of a cascade and connection between all of these.
Yeah. There's an interesting comment in the chat about some managers stoke conflict because they think that it makes employees work harder.
Yeah. And that is, at least in my opinion, such a fallacy, right? Oh, because maybe they do, but it's short term and it's not focusing on the right things for the right reasons. And that's where things can go off the rails so much about why we're doing what we're doing, and sharing our information and creating those positive work environments where we don't actually have to be navigating conflict all the time. But definitely, I completely agree. And that, we'll just get us some healthy competition going, or well, I have my favorites and I'm going to make sure they succeed, whatever that might look like.
Yeah, trends in the
Yep.
comments. Yeah, one of the trends in the comments is I think it's along the lines of communication, has to do with ambiguity in processes and roles, or lack of role clarity, or a personnel authority not being clearly understood. So you may be overstepping bounds that you didn't know existed. Ego. Ego is a big thing
Definitely.
too.
Yeah. Knowledge can be power. And so when it comes to communication, that's one of the biggest challenges with ineffective leaders, is their thoughts around what knowledge should be shared and what should be held, and the benefit of what that information is. It creates everything. And when we talk about positive work environments, like the whole first pillar is communication. All of this being said, we know that not all conflict is negative, and sometimes that avoiding is also a strategy, but healthy conflict in a team is magical. When we look at the stages of teaming, there's a whole stage that is all about how we navigate conflict as a team, right? We know that when we can challenge ideas, we come up with better solutions and collaborate. We can share new ideas and be innovative, not just that, oh, we've always done it this way, or, Bill's our leader, we're going to do it his way, or, Hillary was in this role before, I liked how she did it. We really need different perspectives, and we need those conversations that generate trust. And this is becoming more and more, right? The conversations around psychological safety and the impact it has on the performance and engagement teams have. And that's really where you start building commitment and engagement. And it's not just because of that, kind of stirring things up and creating that kind of competitive, cutthroat, toxic environment. It's not that we can't have fun at work. Our teams, there's a like a department slow team event next week, where I'm sure there'll be some interesting dynamics, but it's more about engaging us and coming together than who wins, right? So just wanted to touch on that, because not all conflict is bad, and that's sometimes where avoiding it is the best strategy, because it actually needs to play out. How do we approach conflict? Sometimes it does need to be in the moment, and that's the kind of first quick model we'll look at in a minute, but it's dealing with it as it emerges. And this is sometimes withdrawing, and sometimes it's smoothing things over. Sometimes it's a bit of a negotiation and collaboration, and that's totally great. That's what we need to do, because it means we're asking questions and considering other viewpoints. What is really nice to do in parallel with that, though, is a longer term strategy about building those positive work environments. And I can't say that enough, that that long game and that short game need to happen together, and that they're both important. We can't just say, oh, we're going to ignore this because we're building this amazing team and we're not going to disagree or have conflict later. No, we need to build the skills and build the trust, but having that longer term strategy and an environment where negative conflict doesn't thrive is a big part of that. So what does that short-term strategy look like? This is the one that Denise had brought to my attention after a conference. I don't know, Denise, if you want to say a little bit about it.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I was at a conference from folks in different universities, and the University of Victoria shared their conflict model that they have in their conflict toolkit, which was very interesting to hear how it all came to be. And then they also talked a little bit about, well, that was built on a model that they found from Eckerd College and a conflict dynamics profile, which really talks about conflict competence. And it was the competence piece that really caught my interest as this being something a little bit different, and some great tools that I think were easy to use and understand.
Absolutely. It's like almost like one web page, and as you navigate through it, there's so much information, and we'll be sharing that in the follow-up summary to this, along with an assessment you can do as well to build that conflict competence in your teams. And it goes to when folks talked about what they do when they see conflict, right? We didn't so much talk about pause, which I can't say enough about. Even I think it was Monday morning, I was in a waiting room for an appointment, and I got a message that kind of triggered me a little bit, and I was just like ready to hop in there and give my answer. And luckily I got called into my appointment, and so my pause was somewhat enforced indirectly, but I had the time then to consider what was really going on, and maybe how I approached this needed to be different. And I think I was able to get to the discussion phase of our little disagreement much more effectively. We just sometimes need to take the time, and it can be hard because when we talk about how we're busy, so we're trying to deal with people who have egos, all of that. Again, think about that person you've had conflict with in the past, or maybe someone you're struggling with now. When conflict comes up, is this the type of approach we're taking, right? We just sometimes need to step back, and same for any kind of difficult conversation. Just that pause gives you time to gather yourself, prepare. Is this the right time?
Sorry.
Does anyone else need to be involved? Yeah, right. And then that consideration, right? Am I thinking about all the sides? Is there something else I need to consider? I just love how clear this is, right? I need to pause. I need to consider. Am I like making assumptions? Do I have some bias going into this conversation, right? And then get to that discussion phase. So it's really the middle of the model is the discussion, where sometimes we try to jump right there. And I think we're rarely as successful as we would be towards a positive outcome if we don't do that. Because then, are you comfortable discussing this? Is there anything you want to share? Like, what's going on for you? Whatever those questions are, and we will share some good guidance on those challenging conversations and how we can prepare. But just getting to the point where we will be candid in terms of what's going on and what our ideas are, and ideally come to some consensus. And then also important in any challenging conversation, taking action, right? After you have a conflict discussion, make sure we said the same thing. I know, Denise, we've talked about folks that we've been in conversations with, and you could have someone talk to each of them afterwards, and the perspective of that conversation is so different. So that clarity around what really happens, what's going to happen next, is there some kind of action items we need to do go forward, and then it's really about that resolving and repairing, which I really appreciated about this model, because sometimes conflict is reduced to just discuss and take action. Because some folks are like, yep, let's, especially if there's some kind of more formal thing that goes into place. Resolution doesn't have to be perfect. It's about, like you said, sometimes the relationship is really important. Sometimes it takes time, and it can even be a cycle. Sometimes maybe after discussion and take action, we go back to discussion. And it's not just a linear process. Again, we'll share some information for all of you who want to dig into this a little more. It's a great model, a simple one, but I think very, very impactful when it comes to being positive in terms of your outcome. As I mentioned, communication is a huge part of building a positive work environment. And this is that longer term strategy, because for those of us who have the opportunity to be on teams where we're like, we don't have much conflict, or when we do, it feels like discussion and debate, and it's respectful and civil. unlike some of the things that we experience as causes of conflict that you shared in our last question, right? What are the expectations? What do I need to do in my role to be successful? How do I get information? How do I share my information? And this transparency really does address gossip and rumors, because if people don't know what's going on, they fill it in. That's where rumors come. And we're like having all these little side conversations trying to navigate all of that. So I can't say enough about communication. And a really cool activity that we like to do is a team charter. And I'll share a link to that because we kind of set those communication norms with our teams about what that looks like. That being said, we still work and interact with people who may or may not have the same approach to things, right? It's everybody may have different approaches to things, but if we can focus on those shared goals that we clearly articulated, right? How can we recognize, understand, and accept others? And sometimes that agree to disagree and not just say we do that, because different viewpoints are so important, and really acknowledging our bias, because that's something I've had to work on personally over the last few years, not making so many assumptions about folks I work with and where they're coming from and what be motivating them or not motivating them. And again, not talking about folks behind their back, and because I try to bring the approach to work that I don't say anything I wouldn't be comfortable saying in front of everyone. So,
yeah, I like to say talk to me, not about me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's far more impactful, because no one's going to improve being talked about. And that could sometimes be the goal, right? I wish Denise would be on time for our meetings, which actually Denise is always better about being on time than I am, to be candid. But why don't I talk to her about what's going on? Like, is her schedule too packed? Should I be booking travel time? Anyway, I can't go on about that. Change, this came up right when we talked about causes of conflict. When there's so much change, communication breaks down. So we have to get really good about that, involving everyone. That collaboration and communication increases exponentially. And it can be like, well, we do all these things, or, oh, that would be nice if we had time. I get that, but we'll try to share some kind of tips and techniques to do this kind of on an ongoing basis, just layering it into the work we already do. And training and support. Folks, training is a positive, right? Learning more about our role, new ways to do things. Sometimes it's a reward for the work we do and being ready to learn new things. And also supporting folks when they don't know what they're doing, because I know incompetence and incivility came up, and sometimes those come out of actually a fear of not knowing, and that imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And
that's where I think competence is a big thing. Training helps with that, and then practice.
Absolutely. And then the easy one, right? Leadership. Leaders just need to do better. Where some of us who are leaders, we just feel like our people aren't helping us out, but really being consistent and fair. And a couple of leaders I'm working with now really struggle with this, because they acknowledge they have kind of their pet people on their teams that they know they can count on and they have history with, but really balancing that out and sharing opportunities, because then folks tend to be, again, we keep those gossip and rumors to a minimum. Being a good communicator, and again, asking people how they need it, what they need, not assuming what folks want from us. I found that to be really interesting when we ask, what do you want to know about? What can I tell you more about? And again, being the people who provide that training and support, creating those safe spaces. And again, that's a course into itself. And then focusing on solution-based discussions, which I'll just show here in the next slide. And I think this is something that we already do, and I've created an article with more information about these, but just focusing on the future, useful change, and forward action. And this layers really nicely on that conversation model with pause through repair and that type of thing, right? And then, of course, the basic tenets of effective conversations when we don't agree. active listening, empathy and perspective, collaborative problem solving, and negotiation and compromise. Again, doing right rather than being right when it comes to, even as a team, how we discuss things, how we plan, how we debrief. Okay. Now, I know we're moving into our little Q&A time, so I just want to kind of bring it all together here on a slide. And again, this I'll share with everyone after, but team communication and conflict resolution. Like communication happens all through that model, you know, pause, consider, discuss, take action, resolve, and repair. There's communication all the way through that. Team building activities and exercises to support collaboration and inclusion. I've been doing that work with the team I'm currently on, and it's been interesting, even in just 6 months, our ability to come together and be candid with each other. And again, I'll share some examples of easy ways to do that, and even with virtual teams. And for those of us that are leaders, and even those of us that aren't, how we look to foster safe workspaces and build trust. And if we're doing the first two right, we're more than halfway there on this list. And then that supportive and collaborative team culture, the focus on solution and positive change. And you still have to be authentic. You know, I know sometimes I can be like overly excited about change, and some folks on my team may struggle with it. But being authentic about what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, and that parts will be hard and parts will be great, and the things we don't know is also really important. My brain hurts from all of this, so I hope we haven't covered all of this too quickly, because a lot of it is, you're like, well, this isn't something I didn't already know. But I think the one thing that Denise and I really wanted to capture is that there's that short term in the moment, and there's that longer term strategy to reduce conflict in our workplaces. And there's a myriad of different models and theories you can apply, but it's just that idea that we need a long-term and a short-term strategy, and that if we keep dealing with it in the moment, it just feels like a hamster wheel, no matter how good our model is. So building that environment where we have less conflict is really key to navigating conflict in our workplaces.
And Heather, I would add, while folks are maybe putting their questions in the chat, I have a question for you. If you were a mentor, a coach, or a leader of someone and wanting to help them in developing some conflict competence, where would you start?
I think a really good one is understanding your own conflict style. And because that conflict competence, like you talked about, and then the other styles, and then reflecting on what that looks like. And I love it when folks do that as a team. Another thing is really, well, I love it if folks can get a coach, but that's a nice to have, definitely not a need to have. Because I think quite often when it comes to successfully navigating conflict, self-awareness is where we have to start, right? Not just fixing others, but making sure we're understanding what our approach is and why we respond to conflict the way we do, and kind of being aware of that. And even for me, it's having those visuals. And that's why we pulled together a one-page summary for everyone today about, I like up on my wall, like pause. Like sometimes for me, it's the why am I talking, the wait analogy, because sometimes I jump right into that solution action taking approach. And so having more of an understanding about what's going on. And then once I have all of this kind of somewhat navigated as a self-awareness step, asking the folks I work with what they need, what they like, assuming we have a relationship where they'll share that. And then kind of the things that we talk about in terms of team cohesion, right? Yeah. I love doing, so even if it's not a new team, but a team charter, which seems all kind of touchy-feely, but it's actually one of the most strategically beneficial techniques I've ever seen for a team really getting all on board with how they work together.
When I did the team charter with my team, we spent some time looking at our working styles and our communication preferences, and we came up with our agreements on how we would resolve conflict, and even just going through the process of understanding, because we might be, yeah.
I lost the end of your answer there, Denise, but I do know absolutely it really, some things we're doing already probably work, but it gives the opportunity to maybe try something new and hear from everyone more collaboratively. Yeah.
Sorry, I got
Now,
booted out, but
what were you up to? We're talking too much. Ben's trying to give us the hook. Maybe before we go into our formal Q&A, I'll just ask folks this next question while things are kind of fresh, if that's okay. Is there something that you can try from what we talked about today? And we covered a lot of things, an inch deep and a mile wide. I can appreciate for the term, but is it that process map? Are you maybe not pausing and considering and jumping right to a different stage? Or maybe you just don't use that approach at all because you just try to avoid conflict. Is there something you can be doing around your work environments and making them more positive? And even those solution-based discussion techniques, they're kind of simple. And I know I covered over them quite quickly, but just the perspective we take when we have conversations as a team can actually be incredibly impactful. And then, of course, that catch-all of bringing it all together, how we just build team cohesion overall. And it can be tempting to say, I'm going to do all of these things, but that doesn't mean we can't do all of them, but maybe the one you try first.
Person definitely said, definitely taking a pause. So that's very important. Be more intentional about repair, just building cohesion. Personally, I love the idea of creating some sort of team charter because it takes into account if your team is small enough, you can find out how everyone kind of likes being communicated to and how they like discussing things. And then drawing out that process with one another. And I really liked how earlier on, Heather, you said resolution doesn't have to be perfect. And I'm assuming the charter that you create and the process that you create doesn't have to be perfect also. It will take iterations. So just get something in place. And so that's awesome. Just give people another minute.
Well, another thing about team charters is they're also they can be the approach that we're like making them with a chisel and stone sometimes, and we're not. It's definitely dry erase on a whiteboard because what works for us this year might not work next year. Maybe we have a different focus to our work or different goals or different people. It's something I think that we should revisit at least annually, and definitely as we have significant changes to a team, because there will be change. And then if we're trying to hold ourselves to a charter that no longer makes sense, it's not effective. So yeah, that's a great one. And if there's any other questions folks have, I know we don't have too much more time, but happy to connect either today or after. Denise and I would be delighted to connect with folks on LinkedIn. This is a topic that's really, really important and not as easy for many of us as some other areas of growth and development. And it can be intimidating to successfully navigate workplace conflict.
Got one question here. How do you break down biases of people in order to have an effective conflict resolution discussion?
It's a great one. What I've done with some teams, and again, this depends on our organization, is we've had, as part of that team cohesion, we've done training on bias and challenging our biases and what implicit bias looks like. And so we can kind of build that self-awareness around what our biases are. And that can be really impactful because then we as a team can say, this is my bias on this is what I'm going to work on. And then there's that collaboration. Sometimes we're not in that space. So acknowledging in a conversation when you see bias, and this can be really tricky depending on the comfort level we have with the person. But I worked with someone when Denise and I were working together, and I just, my question would be like, how do you know that? I'm just curious because I haven't seen that. Like, where is that information or insight coming from? And sometimes it isn't as much bias as I thought, but often it's like, well, I just know, or it's obvious. If we're having answers like that, then there's definitely a bias at play. And I think saying, well, you may think that, but this is what I see. And so I think we have some bias, and like sometimes it's my bias, not theirs, but getting comfortable with acknowledging it.
Yeah. Well, bias is a topic for a whole other multi-day workshop to actually to explore bias and to, so it's a lot to talk about.
It is, and there's great content on LinkedIn, learning if you have it online anywhere, TED Talks. Yeah, it's a journey that we're all still on.
Definitely learning and growing. There's another question. People often talk about 5 conflict resolution models. What do you think is the conflict resolution model that works well for most workplace disputes?
It's the challenge. I don't think there is one. I think in a team charter, you decide which one as a team you want to use. That makes the most sense, and decide on that together if that opportunity presents itself, because it has to be something that everyone kind of agrees on. Otherwise, the one that works best for you. And again, part of what your preference for model will be is what your your conflict style is. And like for me, I tend to be somewhere typically accommodating, or I think it's called consolidating, where I kind of like to bring everything together. And others will be like, no, it has to be a little more direct than that. So I don't think there is one that works for everybody. It's finding one that fits your style, your team, and those on your team best. And that in itself can be a challenging conversation. But how do we want to address conflict as a team? That should be in your team charter.
The person wrote, okay, in quotes, talk to me, not about me. What about people who are very adverse to conflict? Do you have a strategy for very introverted people? Like, should they work with a manager? Or how should they word it? Is there like a script they could use to start heavy and difficult topics of conversation?
That's definitely for folks who are really shy or intimidated or introverted when it comes to conflict. That's where really that preparation is key. And the link in the follow-up is more around difficult conversations, but there's so much continuity between conflict and difficult conversations. And it really is about being prepared. And yes, you can work with your manager or someone you're comfortable talking to, as much as I'm not a huge fan of role playing it out, recording yourself to get more comfortable with it. But I do find that when we find something really intimidating, it really is about that learning more and practicing. And not that we want to be great at conflict, but maybe we do. Um, it's something we need to practice, and when we've avoided it, that takes some time.
Yeah. Thank you. And then there's another one, maybe last one. Well, we still have 11 minutes left, but depending on, do you have some resources on self-assessment and conflict styles? Thanks.
Definitely, and that will be in the follow-up message.
Great.
There's a link to a lab here at the University of Calgary where they have an assessment that you can do as an individual with the team, and there's a whole wealth of information. I know Denise has done it with her team as well.
And it's free.
So and it's free. Yes, I should mention everything I share as a follow-up is free. That's why we love the University of Victoria model for short-term conflict, in that you contribute to their data, but it is actually anonymous, and you get all of that for free, and it gives you a lovely report about your style, your team style of assessment. And it's very similar to, if folks are familiar with the TKI, Thomas Killiman instrument, I think. the same but free. So we're delighted to share those, and I encourage folks to try it out, whether you want to try it out on your own first or with a team. It also kind of leads into that ability to do a little bit of team building together, even on a tricky topic.
Yeah, it's great. And I also like it gives you that opportunity for a little bit of a 360 evaluation or feedback as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Your feedback. I think I'm going to put the feedback survey form in the Q&A section. So if people, before they want to hop off, or if they do need to go somewhere, I'll have the links that Heather's been talking about in the post-webinar email, as well as maybe some parts of the slide deck, as well as this feedback survey for this webinar.
And Denise and I created this for everyone. It's missing the link though to that assessment because I was having trouble with it yesterday. So we'll get this to everyone as a nice little one-page summary, and everything for the most part has a link to a resource on it. But I just need to add the ITP metrics as the lab that we were talking about with the assessment to it. But definitely, hopefully you have enough resources to go back to and explore whatever area was of most interest or that you wanted to know more about.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Heather and Denise. And thank you to everyone who took part and stayed engaged and asked a lot of questions and joined in on all of the different polls and voting. If there's nothing else, is there another slide that you want to share at all? If not, Heather, I think you had one more, which was basically kind of the LinkedIn information, but I'll be sharing this information in the post-webinar email as well with clickable links for everyone. So if that's it, thank you again, Heather. Thank you again, Denise. Everyone, thank you for joining. Have a lovely day.